Right, so today we're going to dive into a topic that I think is really fascinating, but sometimes a little bit misunderstood, maybe a little shrouded in mystery,
Hmm.
BDSM and kink. It's one of those things that a lot of people have heard of, maybe have some vague ideas about,
Right.
but they don't really fully grasp. And so to unravel it all,
Yeah.
we are taking a deep dive into Tristan Taormino's The Ultimate Guide to Kink.
Yeah, that's a great choice.
Have you read it?
I have. It's a fantastic resource for anyone who is curious about BDSM, and I'm really excited to unpack some of the social and psychological layers behind a lot of these practices with you.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
So the book starts by really diving into the language of BDSM.
Okay.
All the acronyms and the terms. It's like you walked into an
Mhm.
alphabet soup party.
Yeah.
I get you the BDSM, your SM, your DIS.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, right?
Hmm.
But Taormino argues that this shared vocabulary is really important.
Mhm.
And honestly, it makes sense. It's like if you join any group, they've got their own lingo,
Absolutely.
Surfers, techies,
Right.
you name it.
Bird watchers.
Bird watchers, exactly.
Yeah.
They've all got their thing. So
You got to know the lingo.
you got to know the lingo.
Right.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because, you study.
Well, it's interesting because that point about the language really resonated with me because it reminded me of some of my research on marginalized communities and how they often use language to sort of reclaim power and define themselves on their own terms.
Oh, wow.
Right. And I think BDSM in many ways mirrors that dynamic.
Wow. I never even thought about it like that. That's such a powerful connection.
Yeah,
It's like creating a space where they can communicate openly and honestly without judgment.
precisely. Yeah. And that open communication is essential, especially when you're discussing things like consent and boundaries, because if everyone understands the terminology, then you minimize the risk of miscommunication.
Right, especially around some of these topics, which can be a
Exactly.
little bit more sensitive.
That's true.
Now, one of the things I found really fascinating was how Taormino actually delves into the history of some of these terms.
Oh, interesting.
Like, for instance, did you know that B&D, that started popping up in personal ads back in the 70s?
Really?
Yeah, and then there's leather
Right.
with its roots in, like, post-World War II gay male biker culture.
Wow. Fascinating.
Talk about a history lesson.
It is interesting how language evolves and how these evolutions really reflect broader social shifts.
Right.
I mean, take the move from the more clinical term, sadomasochism or SM, to BDSM.
Hold on, can we unpack that a little bit? Like, why is that shift so important?
Yeah, because by using less clinical language, it allows people to embrace these practices on their own terms, right? So it removes that stigma and it allows BDSM to be viewed through a lens of personal identity and community rather than through a purely medical or psychological one.
It's like reclaiming the narrative,
Exactly.
defining themselves
Yeah.
instead of being defined by others.
Exactly. And that sense of ownership is vital for the ethical and consensual practice of BDSM, which leads us to what Taormino calls the core principles:
Okay.
consent, negotiation, safety, communication, and aftercare.
When I first saw that list, I thought, okay, this is getting serious.
Yeah.
But then as I kept reading, I realized these aren't just buzzwords. Like, these are fundamental guidelines to make sure that everyone involved feels safe and respected.
I agree. And I think it's refreshing to see them articulated so clearly.
Mm.
And honestly, these principles, they apply to any healthy relationship, wouldn't you say?
100%. Like, think about my own relationships. Those principles, like open communication about what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with, that's key.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about BDSM. It's about respect and responsibility, no matter what you're into.
Exactly.
And I love how Taormino uses real life examples to illustrate these principles.
Yeah.
Like, she talks about creating a yes, no, maybe list for negotiation,
Right.
which is such a simple but brilliant idea.
Mm. You know, that reminded me of how crucial clear communication is in therapy as well.
Mm-hmm.
This yes, no, maybe list is like a tool to help people advocate for their needs. And that's relevant whether you're exploring kink or just trying to set boundaries with your in-laws.
That's hilarious. So true.
Right.
Everybody needs healthy boundaries.
Absolutely.
And on the topic of safety, I was really struck by the book's emphasis on safe words
Mm-hmm.
and using clear signals to stop or slow down a scene. Like, this is serious stuff.
It is, and this is where the idea of risk-aware consensual kink, or RACK, comes in. Have you ever heard of that?
RACK. That's a new one for me.
Okay, so RACK essentially means acknowledging that BDSM inherently involves some degree of risk, but that responsible participants take steps to minimize harm and prioritize safety.
Okay.
So think of it like rock climbing.
Okay.
It's inherently risky,
Right.
but you mitigate that risk with the right gear, the right knowledge, and a trusted partner.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So it's all about being prepared, knowing your limits, and having that open communication throughout the entire experience.
Exactly.
And that responsibility, it extends beyond the actual BDSM scene itself, right?
Yeah,
The book really emphasizes the importance of aftercare.
absolutely.
So what exactly is aftercare?
So aftercare is really about taking care of someone's physical and emotional well-being after a scene, especially if it involved, intense sensations or power dynamics.
It's like you've shared this incredibly intense and vulnerable experience.
Right.
So taking the time to reconnect, to care for each other afterwards, it just makes sense.
It
It
does.
speaks volumes about the level of care and consideration that's involved in ethical BDSM.
I couldn't agree more. It really highlights that these practices, when done responsibly, can be about connection, trust, mutual respect, just like any other form of intimate interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the principles, the communication, the safety, but now let's dive into the actual practices, because I have to admit, this is where the book got really juicy. Taormino doesn't just give you this like dry list of BDSM practices.
Right.
She brings them to life with these vivid real-life stories.
She does, yeah.
Like, for instance, sensory deprivation.
Okay.
Who knew that, like, limiting your senses could be so stimulating?
It does challenge our typical assumptions about pleasure, doesn't it? Because you think, to enjoy ourselves, we need all of our senses. But for some people, that intense focus and the heightened sensations that come from sensory deprivation is incredibly erotic.
It's like some people love roller coasters, right? And other people, they can't even stand the thought of it.
Right.
It's like it's all in how our brains are wired.
Precisely. We all experience pleasure differently.
Now we have to talk about impact play.
Okay.
Like spanking, caning, flogging. Like, I feel like that's what a lot of people think of when they think of BDSM, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And honestly, even I was surprised by what I learned.
What surprised you?
So she shares this story about this woman, Madison, who describes her experience with a heavy flogger. And she says that the impact made her feel incredibly connected to both her body and her partner.
Wow.
It's like, who knew that pain could be so pleasurable?
Well, it is fascinating, but it's important to remember that pain is subjective, right?
Right.
And in the context of consensual BDSM, where safety and trust are paramount, pain can be experienced in entirely different ways.
Okay, that makes sense. But, like, how does that work? Why would somebody find pain pleasurable in that context?
Well, think about it this way. When we experience pain, our bodies release endorphins and adrenaline.
Right.
It's a natural response.
Sure.
But in a BDSM scene, combined with the intimacy, the trust, the heightened emotions, those chemicals can actually create a sense of euphoria and intense pleasure for some people.
Okay.
So it's not about enjoying pain for pain's sake.
Right.
It's about the context and the shared experience.
So it's like our brains reinterpreting those signals based on the situation.
Exactly.
You know what it reminds me a little bit of? Runner's high. You're pushing your body, you're in pain, but there's this like incredible sense of accomplishment and even pleasure that comes with it.
That's a great comparison because it really is all about how our brains are interpreting those physical sensations.
Okay, so we've covered sensory deprivation,
Right.
we've covered impact play. What about role playing? I mean, the book goes into some really interesting scenarios.
Right.
And I have to say, some of them were a little too out there, even for me.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of role-playing, isn't it? It allows you to sort of step outside of your everyday life
Yeah.
and explore different aspects of yourself, even if it's just within the confines of that scene.
Right. Like, she talks about everything from the classic, doctor-patient dynamic to more elaborate fantasies. Like, there's this whole kidnapping scenario that this person Q described. It's like, what drives people to explore these kinds of scenarios?
It's all about fantasy and exploration. And what I think is really fascinating is that a lot of these role-playing scenarios, even outside of BDSM, often have this built-in power dynamic,
Okay.
which can be really appealing to explore in a safe and controlled way.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right.
Like, even in everyday life, we have those power dynamics.
All the time.
Boss, employee,
Teachers,
teacher, student. Exactly.
parent, child.
And BDSM role-playing kind of gives us this framework to explore those dynamics in a way that's again, consensual and safe.
Exactly.
It's like we all have these fantasies, these hidden desires and curiosities. And BDSM, with its emphasis on communication and consent, allows people to kind of explore those fantasies ethically and responsibly.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So but we've covered a lot of ground here, from sensory deprivation to impact play to role-playing.
Right.
It's clear that BDSM is incredibly diverse.
It is.
And there's so much more to it than meets the eye.
For sure.
You know, it's funny. After reading all of this, it really struck me that people who are into BDSM are really doing it for the same reasons anyone enjoys sex. Connection, pleasure, exploration.
Right.
BDSM is just its own unique and often more intense path to those experiences.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and it really challenges us to broaden our perspective on what's considered normal when it comes to sexuality.
Right.
Because what one person might find taboo could be deeply meaningful and important to someone else.
It's all about understanding that desire is complex, it looks different for everyone,
Absolutely.
and of course, respecting those differences.
Of course, yeah. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Taormino doesn't shy away from the complexity of BDSM,
Right.
but she also avoids sensationalizing it, which I think is a tough balance to strike.
Right. It's informative, but it never feels judgmental.
Right.
It really encourages you to approach this world with like a genuine curiosity and an open mind.
And a willingness to challenge your own assumptions. Right?
Speaking of challenging assumptions,
Yeah.
towards the end, Taormino talks about how BDSM can be a way to explore power dynamics safely and consensually. But what if we took that a step further?
Okay.
Do you think there are lessons that we can learn from BDSM even if we're not interested in the practices themselves?
That's an intriguing thought, and I think you're onto something.
Okay.
Because whether we realize it or not, power dynamics show up everywhere, in our relationships, in our workplaces, even just interacting with strangers on the street.
Sure.
Understanding how those dynamics work, especially the elements of consent and negotiation that are so central to BDSM, I think could be incredibly valuable for anyone.
So you're saying that by understanding these principles, we could navigate those everyday power dynamics with more awareness and more agency,
Exactly.
regardless of our interest in BDSM.
Yes, it's about taking those core principles, consent, communication, respect, and really applying them to all aspects of our lives.
It's like BDSM offers this framework for understanding and navigating power dynamics in a way that maybe we haven't considered before.
Precisely. It encourages us to really examine our own boundaries, our own desires, our own comfort levels in a way that I think can be beneficial in just countless situations.
That's such an insightful takeaway.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, we really encourage you to kind of reflect on what resonated with you today.
Yeah.
Maybe something surprised you or sparked a new curiosity.
For sure.
Because as with BDSM itself, the journey of understanding is really about exploration with open eyes and a willingness to learn.
I completely agree. That's a great place to end it.